All right, we're live. Okay. All right. Hi, everybody. I'm Marshall Price. I'm the Nancy Hanks Curator of Modern and Contemporary Art here at the Nasher Museum of Art at Duke University. And we are here in the Miró exhibition. Miró, the experience of seeing. During our last Google Hangout, we talked a little bit about the history of Miró, provided a little context for the show. So we are here live and in person now in the exhibition. And this is going to be a little bit like Sister Wendy Meets the Khan Academy. And we're going to walk you through some parts of the exhibition. If you have questions during the transmission, please type them in. We'll be happy to answer them. And I'm here with a couple of my helpful colleagues. Julien Chevalier is behind the scenes, and Jay Caldwell as well is taking photographs as we speak. So welcome, and we're going to begin here at the entrance to the exhibition. So this large painting that you see behind me is work by Miró called Woman, Bird, and Star, Homage to Picasso. And it's from 1966 to 73. And it's a really wonderful introduction to the exhibition because it's not only one of Miró's sort of iconic figure images done in his sort of signature style, using a collage type approach to the work with the very bright primary colors laid on top of one another. But it's also an important work in terms of the context of Miró's overall body of work. He was working on the painting for several years and finished it on the day of his friend Pablo Picasso's death. And Pablo Picasso, another Spanish artist, a very well-known Spanish artist, countryman to Miró. They were very good friends for many, many decades. And upon Picasso's death, Miró finished the painting and titled it as an homage to his friend. And you can see several sort of hallmarks of Miró in the painting. Not only do we have this abstracted figure before us, but we see very prominently in the left-hand side of the painting a large star, which is really one of the artist's signature symbols that he uses throughout his entire career. And if you look very closely in the lower right portion of the painting, you can also see this blue crescent, which represents a bird. And this was a symbol that Miró developed beginning very early on, dating all the way back to the 1920s, and it was one that he uses throughout his entire career. So if you look at some of the other works in the exhibition, as you'll see, he uses these symbols repeatedly throughout. This painting also makes a nice pairing with this sculpture here called Figure from 1969. And Figure is a bronze sculpture, and one of the wonderful things I think about this work paired with the painting is that Miró takes a similar type of collage approach in the creation of the work. And so what he's done is gathered various objects. If you recall from the first Google Hangout, we talked about how Miró was a constant and consummate gatherer of various objects, trash, industrial implements, whatever he found and could use in his work, he would collect and bring to the studio. And here we can see that he's assembled these objects. So very clearly on the bottom is a piece of wood, a log from a tree. This second part here is probably some type of driftwood, but he's added, if you notice, two small extensions on either side, indicating the arms of this figure. On top of that is probably either a stone or a piece of ceramic that Miró fashioned himself in the shape of a face with two eyes on either side of the head. And then on top, he sort of in a witty fashion, a humorous fashion, a gourd representing the figure's hat with these funny sort of fondue-like forks coming out of the top of it. So by looking at this, you can immediately see how Miró was full of humor and wit and was not bogged down by sort of heavy-handed or didactic types of works in any way, shape, or form. So let's move over here and just talk very briefly about these works in this corner. On my right is the Warrior King. It's a sculpture from 1981. And it's, again, another good example of how Miró used a collage-type aesthetic in terms of his sculptural practice. We've got a board, a piece of driftwood perhaps, a large spoon coming out from the center of it, and then what looks like some sort of round industrial-type object as the Warrior King's head. Now, the spoon is an interesting object because it could be perhaps the king's hand, it could be perhaps the king's scepter, or it could be a representation of the male sex of the figure as well. So we don't know, and that's one of the wonderful things about Miró sculpture, is that it can be read in any number of ways and interpreted as you like. One of the wonderful things about the exhibition that I'll point out here between the Warrior King painting and sculpture and this painting behind me called Spanish Woman from 1974 is this inherent connection between painting and sculpture. And not only is the connection stylistic and a formal one, you can see this large sort of round industrial implement in the Warrior King painting sculpture next to this round drawn line in Spanish Woman, but also there is a conceptual connection between the paintings and the sculpture. And so he's exploring these characters both in 2 and 3 dimensions on a number of different levels. Miró mentioned during his life that he was interested in creating a phantasmagoric world of living monsters. And what we see when we look at the works closely is we see these characters almost as if they're playing out in some type of metaphysical drama.
Marshall, I'm going to interrupt you with a question that's just come up. Are the sculptures influenced by the painting? Is Miró working out problems in 2D and 3D?
Yes. So we have a question about the sculptures and the paintings, and is the artist working out problems in 2 and 3 dimensions? And I would say definitively yes. He is certainly addressing some of the same subjects and themes, both in painting and sculpture. The sculpture, if you all recall from our first Google Hangout, really began to play a prominent part of his artistic practice in the 1960s. So he underwent several decades of immense creativity, particularly with the sculptures. So Miró is primarily known as a painter and a printmaker by most, but during this last portion of his life, he underwent a tremendous burst of creativity in making 3-dimensional work. And for him, I think it provided just another outlet in terms of exploring some of the same themes that he had worked on for many years. So keep those questions coming. So we're going to move on to the next section of the gallery and talk about several other works in the exhibition. So behind me is a painting as well as on my left-hand side, and 2 sculptures on my right-hand side. And again, these 3 works are an excellent example of this strong connection between painting and sculpture in the exhibition, and the similarities that really are current throughout. The painting is called Figure Before Landscape from 1963, and it's the earliest work in the exhibition. You can see that there are these drawn lines before a green background in a very abstract way. And one of the things that I'd like to point out with regard to this painting is that Miró always considered himself a representational artist. He did not consider himself to be an abstract artist. So his works are filled with actual images. Now, they may be difficult to read, or they may provide a challenge in terms of deciphering the images, but the images are there nonetheless. So he's created this landscape by using a field of green in the background. And the figure is made up of these heavily drawn black lines, this large sort of circular shape for the body, and these two elements that are held upward toward the sky, representing the arms. And if you notice in the upper right corner, there's a large red dot surrounded by a yellow circle, which may represent the sun, the moon, or some combination of other type of celestial body. The work's title is also a clue to some of the themes that are important to Miró. Figure before a landscape. Landscape was a constant theme throughout his entire life. And if you remember from our last Google Hangout, I talked quite a bit about how he was inspired and influenced by the Majorcan landscape, as well as the landscape in the small town of Montroig, where he spent some time in the 19-teens. So we'll see that throughout in some of the other works as well. Now, with regard to the two relief sculptures on the other side of me here, we can see an inherent formal connection between the relief sculptures and the painting that we just saw. What he's done here, however, is really drawn in 3 dimensions. And again, we can see that he's used whatever he's found at his disposal. This piece on the right, if you look very closely, it has a series of corrugations at the top, indicating that it was at one time a piece of corrugated cardboard. On the lower right-hand portion of the sculpture here, we see what appears to be a small medicine bottle, perhaps. And most likely he's added these high relief ridges in order to create the image of this work. They don't have specific titles beyond bas relief or low relief, but they are very much linked to his abstracted figures that we saw in the painting. And they were inspired most likely by a visit he made to the prehistoric caves at Altamira in Spain, where he saw very similar types of carvings in the rock surface.
And we've got another question from Carol Wilson. She's curious about, did he paint outside on plein air, or did he always work in a studio?
We have a question by Carol Wilson. Did the artist paint outside in plein air, or did he work in his studio? He worked primarily in his studio, Carol. He was not a plein air painter in the conventional sense of the term. But, you know, I would say that the landscape and the natural world had such an impact on him, and he was in it every day, taking walks or swims, that in many ways it is the foundation for so much of his work. So I wouldn't call him a plein air painter in the conventional sense, but the natural world was instrumental in the creation of his works. So let's move on and talk about painting and the sculpture in the corner of the gallery over here. Now, I mentioned before that Miró is interested in creating a phantasmagoric world of living monsters, and this sculpture here, figure from 1981, is the perfect example of that. It's also a really wonderful example of how the natural world informed Miró's work. Miró took regular walks in the countryside and was among the rustic landscape of Majorca in his later years. And he would see stone formations and various other objects along his way. And these played into the creation of works such as Figure that we see here. For the body, he's taken what looks like a sort of crumpled up piece of metal and used it as is. On top, he's placed maybe a large stone that he's carved into, or maybe a piece of ceramic that he's worked on in the studio. To that, he's added this very funny sort of nose in the front, 2 ears on either side, and then perhaps a hat or some sort of other adornment on top in the form of a small bottle that he's cast. And the process that he used to make these really allowed him to incorporate any type of object that he could in the work. He used what we call the lost wax technique, which allowed him to collect various materials in metal, wood, plastic, any type of material, and combine them in any given order. A wax mold was then made of that, and that was cast in bronze. So the process really allowed him to assemble objects that maybe wouldn't have necessarily gone together otherwise. The process also allowed him to add his own hand in the process of making the sculpture itself. So at the stage when it was a wax mold, he could carve into it, he could draw into it, and really add his own mark to the objects. This figure, this sculpture, also makes a really wonderful pairing with this painting to my left called Landscape. And again, it's one of several works in the exhibition with a fairly generic title, Landscape. But it's another indication of just how important the land was to the artist and how inspirational it was to him. We see what looks like some type of bird before this very open space, and he's included a large area of blue in the upper right, a sort of black square type shape in the upper left, a sort of enigmatic dot of purple in the middle, and this figure looking very much like a bird in the lower portion of the painting. And Miró was very much influenced by vernacular traditions in Spain, and in particular, he was enamored with a certain type of clay whistle that is found only on the island of Majorca, known as a cirel. And these clay whistles were painted with bright greens and reds, with a lot of the white clay showing through. And this figure that we see in the landscape here is extremely reminiscent of these cirel figures. And I'm sure that that was probably a great inspiration to him when he made this painting. So we're going to move on. And I wanted to talk just for a few minutes about the 4 paintings in this space here. These are 4 very sparsely painted works, perhaps the most sparsely painted in the exhibition, but really in so many ways evocative of the artist's interest in, reliance on, and inspiration from the landscape. As I said, and we've said this many times now, that he was continually inspired and interested in the landscape of Majorca. And you know, we can see that in works like this. This is called Dance of the Poppies, and it dates from 1973. And I just find it to be not only an unbelievably beautiful painting, but also really operating as an aesthetic experience given his economy of brushstroke. What he's done in this painting is essentially taken the black paint and made 2 lines on the painting and added these 3 small red marks just to indicate, just a suggestion of the poppy fields of Majorca. One thing also that I would like to mention is that, you know, a lot of these works look like they're perhaps improvised or hastily created or done in an instant, but that's actually not the case. In fact, the execution may not have taken very long, But with almost every work that Miró created, he did studies, he did sketches. He thought about it for a long time before he would take paint to canvas and make those marks. In addition, we're looking at this mature body of work by an artist who, at this point, is now in his 70s and 80s. And so he's got this wave of a lifetime of experience behind him in the creation of these works. So let's move on, and we're just going to keep going through the show and talk a little bit more about one or two more works before we conclude. And if there are any questions, please send them along, because we love to have questions, and I hope to elucidate some aspects of Miró's work and life. I wanted to talk a little bit about this sculpture here, because it's one of not only the more playful works in the exhibition, it also shows his process very well, and it deals with some of the themes that are most prevalent in Miró's work. The title of the work is Figure and Bird. Again, another generic title in many ways. Miró had a tendency to title his works in a very generic way, and I think that was partially because he wanted not to be so heavy-handed or didactic, but allow for an infinite amount of interpretation from the viewer. Certainly we see him dealing with broad overarching themes such as life and death and fertility, but I think he wanted to allow the viewer to be liberated from any type of sort of constrictive interpretation. So we can see in Figure with Bird, he's again used a collage type of aesthetic or approach to the creation of the sculpture itself by using what was a basket, a very regional type of Catalonian basket that's actually still in use today for the head of the figure. It's dead. It's dead.
We're out of
Oh, I was on a roll there.